The Icelandic sagas do not generally include lavish descriptions of landscape, but there are hardly any ambiguities in regard to the settings. Naming the landscape is a routine saga method, and the reader pretty much always knows where the events happen. How can we describe the overall function of landscape and geography in the sagas? I asked Emily Lethbridge, research lecturer at the Department of Name Studies in the Árni Magnússon Institute in Reykjavik, about landscape in the sagas.
Well, I think landscape in the sagas fulfills several functions, really, which we can discuss now. First and foremost, landscape is incredibly important as a sort of organising structure. It's the physical frame within which all of the events described in the sagas take place. Everything has to happen somewhere, and so often the action is, as you say, very specifically located in specific places. It functions very much as a way of organising narrative too. So I think alongside genealogy, references to places in the sagas help the audiences, help people understand where things are taking place and who is connected to whichever place. Landscape, I think, very much sometimes functions even as an actor or has a certain agency in some of the sagas, which is to say it's not a passive backdrop, but it kind of has a very discernible influence on the action of the sagas and how certain events play out. Events such as ambushes on characters, of course, are very carefully rooted and staged in the landscape, to take one example. And the landscape too can sort of be complicit in pushing or sort of prompting events. Take one example from Hrafnkels saga, which is set in the east of Iceland. And there's a scene in which a shepherd called Einar has to look for some missing sheep. And this scene is very carefully rooted in the landscape. His journey around the local area looking for these sheep is very carefully positioned in the landscape. And the landscape itself, in conjunction with natural phenomena, the weather, sort of conspire against him finding the sheep, and then in the end the sheep are found in a place that he passed right at the beginning. So there's a sense that the landscape is sort of more than just a passive backdrop, but an actor in that scene, having an agency.
Early one morning, Einar went outside and saw that the drizzle and mist had cleared up in the south. He took a staff, a bridle and a saddle cloth and waded across Grjóteigs River, which flows past the Shieling. The sheep which had been there the night before were lying on the gravel flats down by the river. He drove them up to the Shieling and set out in search of the missing ones. Then he noticed the horses farther down by the river and decided to catch one of them to ride on, for he kept thinking how much more ground he could cover by riding than by walking. But when he came closer, all the mares bolted away from him, and he chased them without success. They had never been so shy before. Only Freyfaxi remained behind. He was as still as if he were anchored to the ground. Einar realized the morning was wearing on and decided to ride the stallion, thinking that Hrafnkell would never find out. So he bridled Freyfaxi, fixed the saddlecloth on his back, and rode up along Grjótárgil, south to the glacier, and then west along the edge of the ice to the source of Jökuls River. From there he followed the river down to Reykjaskíling. He inquired at all the Shílings whether any of the shepherds had seen his ewes, but no one had. Einar rode Freyfaxi from dawn to mid-evening, travelling fast and far, for this was an outstanding horse. Then it occurred to Einar that he had better drive in the sheep at the Shieling, even though he had failed to find the others. So he rode east across the ridges over to Hrafnkelsdale, and when he came down to Grjótteig, he heard the bleating of sheep beside the ravine which he had passed earlier in the morning. When he turned in that direction, he saw 30 ewes come running towards him, and these were the sheep which had been missing for a week. He drove them in with the rest of his ewes. Then he led the stallion back to the herd and walked up to the shieling.